When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not because I feared getting caught, but because I remembered what I'd forgotten to erase. Those messages. The ones I swore I would delete but never did. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling, but he pulled it back effortlessly, eyes still locked on the screen. I watched his face shift as he read line after line, and I felt the walls of my life collapsing around me. Yes, he was about to learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands shook as he kept swiping, and I knew he was getting closer to the one message that would destroy everything. The message that would either explain too much or confuse everything even more. Then the phone buzzed in his hands, and a new notification lit up the screen. I saw his face lose all color as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm terrified. My nerves twisted into something colder, darker, as the reality of what I'd done clawed its way to the surface. I could hear the sharp rhythm of his breathing from across the room. This was it. The moment I had feared more than anything. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that changed everything. And now, I don't know what happens next. But let me tell you how it all really began. Before I share the secret I tried so hard to bury, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this. Have you ever had a secret you thought you'd hidden forever, only to realize you hadn't hidden it at all? It started with a suitcase in the hallway. I heard the front door open before I saw him, the sound of boots scuffing tile, a duffel bag landing with a dull thud. My husband called my name from the foyer, his voice echoing through the quiet house, cheerful in a way that felt forced. I didn't answer at first. I was in the kitchen, still holding a dish towel I'd been using to dry a wine glass, staring at nothing. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, brushing wind from his shoulders and shaking off the last bits of winter. "Guess who I ran into," he said, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I knew before he said it. He stepped aside and motioned toward the hall, and there he was. A man I hadn't seen in years, standing in our entryway like he belonged there. A duffel at his feet, a jacket draped over his arm, and that same unreadable calm that had always unsettled me. I smiled, the kind of smile you give out of politeness, not joy. "Long time," I said. He nodded, his eyes lingering just a second too long. Too long. My husband clapped a hand on his shoulder, completely unaware of the shift in the room's temperature. "He's going through a rough patch." I told him he could stay a few days. Crash in the guest room. The towel was still damp in my hands. I gave a small, measured nod. "Of course. You're welcome here." Later that night, after dinner and brief conversation, after the laughter that tried too hard and the silence that followed too easily, I stood by the staircase watching the guest room door close behind him. I told myself it would be temporary. That a few days wouldn't change anything. But I already knew that wasn't true. The next morning was filled with familiar sounds, the hum of the coffee machine, the creak of the cabinet above the sink, the television murmuring headlines in the living room. I moved through it all like a ghost, doing what I always did, but watching everything more closely. He sat at the kitchen table, reading a book, my book, I realized, one of the older psychology texts I kept on the shelf in my office. He looked up and smiled like he belonged there. "This is good," he said, holding it up. "You wrote notes in the margins." I nodded slowly, unsure what to say. Occupational hazard. That night, I noticed how he lingered in the doorway while I set the table. How his presence made the air feel tight. How his questions during dinner always steered the conversation back to me. "What made you want to become a psychologist?" he asked, as my husband reached for the salt. I hesitated. "To understand people better." He looked at me, quiet for a beat. "Have you figured us out yet?" My husband laughed. She's still trying to figure me out. We all laughed. But mine felt hollow. In the days that followed, the house adjusted to a new rhythm, one I didn't recognize. The guest room door opened earlier. He was in the kitchen when I came down, in the hallway when I turned a corner, in the background of every moment. Always just there. Never too close. Never inappropriate. But always just enough. I told myself I was imagining it, the extra second his hand brushed against mine, the way his gaze didn't drop when I looked up from my book. I told myself it was harmless. That he was just a guest, a friend, someone in need. But something deeper had settled into the cracks of our home, a quiet, magnetic pull that neither of us named but both of us fed. One afternoon, my husband was out late at work. I had just finished a remote session with a client, a young woman struggling with her marriage, when I walked into the living room and saw him sitting there, watching the muted television. He looked up as I entered. "You look tired." "Long session," I replied. He patted the cushion next to him. "Sit for a minute." I did. Not because I wanted to, or maybe because I did. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, just full. The kind that carries all the things left unsaid. "You help so many people," he said quietly. "Do you ever wonder who helps you?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed, but it came out thin. "That's not really how it works." "It should be." I didn't answer. I just stood and excused myself to go fold laundry that didn't exist. That night, as I lay next to my husband in bed, listening to his breath even out into sleep, I stared at the ceiling and realized something terrifying. I had missed this feeling. This unease. This hunger. This possibility. I hadn't felt it in years. And I didn't know whether I hated it or wanted more. The bar wasn't planned. It never was. It started with a cancelled meeting and an overlong commute, the kind of evening that drags without asking permission. I'd been meaning to stop by a colleague's farewell gathering, something low-key, a drink or two, nothing personal. My husband was working late, again, and I was already halfway into my coat before the guilt had a chance to form. When I arrived, the group was scattered across the back corner of a quiet pub, the kind with dark walls, soft lighting, and the faint scent of citrus polish on worn wooden booths. Familiar laughter rose above the clink of glasses, and I smiled automatically. These people knew me as the composed one, reliable, thoughtful, polite. I played the role without effort. But then I saw him. He sat at the far end of the table, a half-finished drink in front of him, speaking to no one in particular. Our eyes met across the noise, and in that instant, everything around me went strangely still. I don't remember who invited him. I don't even know if he was invited. But he was there. And I didn't leave. He made room beside him with the ease of someone who had anticipated my arrival. I slid in, hesitant, keeping a safe distance, though my body betrayed me in small ways, a turned shoulder, a bent wrist, the lean of my torso when he spoke. Our conversation wasn't remarkable. The topics were neutral, the city, traffic, the weather last week. But in the undercurrent of every exchange was a question neither of us voiced. I noticed his hands more than I should have. Noticed the slight delay in his laugh, the way he waited for me to finish my sentences, like he was studying the shape of my thoughts. I noticed, too, how quickly I forgot about time. When the group began to thin, I stood to leave. He did too. Outside, the air had cooled, the sky sagging under the weight of midnight. I said I'd call a cab. He offered to wait. I said it wasn't necessary. He stayed anyway. We stood near the curb, alone now, as the hum of the city dulled to background static. I looked up at him, said something about the night, about how unexpected things have a way of changing everything. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't ready to give. And then we kissed. Not long. Not tender. Not desperate. Just enough. Enough to confirm that whatever had been building wasn't imagined. Enough to make everything afterward irreversibly different. I pulled away first. He didn't move. I stepped back, barely whispering a goodbye. He didn't answer. I turned and walked quickly toward the street corner, my hands clenched inside my coat sleeves, my mind blank. The cab came. I sat in the back and stared out the window, unable to find a single coherent thought. Only sensations remained, the warmth of his hand near mine, the taste of silence before our lips touched, the sharp sting of knowing I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. When I arrived home, the house was still. My husband was already asleep, the television humming faintly in the den, forgotten. I stood in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the light. I took off my coat, then put it back on, then removed it again. My reflection in the microwave door looked unfamiliar, older, maybe, or simply stripped of illusion. I poured a glass of water and didn't drink it. I stood at the sink, watching the moonlight cut across the floor, and I tried to make sense of what I had done. Was it betrayal if it was only a moment? Was it desire or loneliness? Or was it something deeper, a realization that I had been starving emotionally for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen? I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside my husband, listening to the rhythm of his breath, and wondered if he noticed the change in me, the microscopic shift, the tilt of my silence. In the morning, I wore my old perfume. The one I hadn't touched in years. The one he used to compliment. He didn't say anything. He kissed my cheek distractedly, asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no. Later, I passed the guest room and paused outside the door. It was closed. No sounds came from inside. I didn't knock. I walked away. All day, I moved through work like an automaton. My clients talked, their voices echoing through the screen. I nodded, asked questions, gave guidance, all the while feeling like a stranger inside my own life. By evening, I found myself staring out the kitchen window again, the sky beginning to darken. The house behind me felt heavier than usual, the walls too close, the rooms too quiet. And still, I hadn't told anyone. Not my husband. Not a friend. Not even myself, not fully. Because to tell the truth would be to name it. And I wasn't ready for names. The morning after the kiss unfolded like any other. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in thin, pale strips, brushing the hardwood floors with quiet indifference. The clock beside my bed blinked 7:08. I had already been awake for hours. My husband was in the shower when I walked into the kitchen. I moved without sound, without thought. The coffee maker clicked, a mechanical certainty that grounded me in the illusion of normalcy. I placed 2 mugs on the counter, one for him, one for me, as I had done hundreds of times before. When he walked in, toweling his hair, he kissed the top of my head lightly, muttering something about an early meeting and traffic. I nodded, smiled, added milk to his cup the way he liked. The motions came easily, as if they belonged to someone else. Someone untouched. I wondered if I looked different. If the kiss had marked me somehow, if my skin carried some new signal. But he didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and chose not to see. Either way, I said nothing. He left with a quick goodbye, brief and distracted. The door shut behind him, and with it, the version of myself he knew. I stood alone in the silence, one hand still around the warm ceramic of my untouched coffee. I didn't see the guest until noon. He emerged from the guest room with quiet steps, wearing a worn t-shirt and jeans, his hair unkempt, as if he'd slept deeply, or not at all. I had no idea which. He said nothing at first. Just walked past me to the fridge, took a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. I stayed at the table, pretending to read the emails on my laptop. My hands hovered over the keys, unmoving. My eyes tracked the blinking cursor, not the screen. I didn't look up. But I could feel him. The space between us vibrated with the memory of the night before. The air was different now, heavy and uncertain. Neither of us spoke about what had happened. The words didn't come. Perhaps they couldn't. Eventually, he broke the silence. "You all right?" I glanced up. "Fine." He nodded slowly, like he didn't believe me but wouldn't press. I appreciated the restraint more than I expected. Later, when he left to run an errand, something about picking up a part for his car, I finally exhaled. The silence returned, but it was no longer a comfort. It was a weight. I spent the next few hours cleaning the kitchen, organizing drawers that didn't need organizing, wiping countertops that were already clean. I folded towels I didn't remember washing. I opened and closed cabinets just to hear the hinges creak. By mid-afternoon, I sat in my home office and stared at my reflection in the darkened screen of my laptop. My face looked sharper somehow, not older, but more defined, as if my features had solidified around some unspoken truth. The guilt I expected hadn't arrived. Not yet. What I felt instead was confusion, layered and deep. I had always thought guilt would be sharp, immediate, a lashing sting. But this was slow and suffocating, like trying to breathe through thick cloth. At 4 o'clock, my first client of the day logged in. A woman in her early 40s, struggling with trust issues in her marriage. She looked tired, her voice flat. "He says he loves me," she told me, "but he doesn't really see me. Not anymore." I listened, asked the questions I was trained to ask. I offered the support I knew how to give. But her words sliced through me with unexpected accuracy. I didn't just understand her. I was her. When the session ended, I closed the laptop and rested my forehead on the desk, breathing in the faint scent of cedar and ink from the pages scattered around me. I didn't cry. I just sat there, absorbing the weight of what I hadn't said out loud. By evening, the house had returned to its usual rhythm. My husband was back, moving from room to room with familiar purpose. He didn't ask how my day had gone. I didn't ask about his. We sat through dinner in a quiet that might have passed for comfort in another life. He read headlines on his phone between bites. I watched the flicker of candlelight dance across the surface of the table. The guest joined us late, apologizing with a quiet smile and setting his plate down with practiced ease. I wondered how long he intended to stay. I wondered why I hadn't asked. During dinner, conversation flowed easily between the men, old stories, work, a shared memory of a fishing trip years ago. I contributed only when necessary. My words felt borrowed, like someone else's vocabulary. At one point, our eyes met across the table. Just for a second. It wasn't dramatic. No one noticed. But I felt it, a jolt of something raw and unformed, like a current just beneath the surface. After the dishes were cleared and my husband disappeared into the den to take a late call, I stood by the sink, rinsing plates that were already clean. I didn't hear him approach. "You don't have to pretend nothing happened," he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. I didn't turn around. "I'm not pretending." He didn't reply. Just stood behind me in the quiet. I could hear his breath, steady and close. It made my skin hum with something I didn't know how to name. "I didn't plan it," I said. "I know." I nodded, staring down at the water spiraling into the drain. "It can't happen again." There was a long pause before he answered. "Okay. But even in that single word, I heard the lie. The same one I'd just told myself. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, wide awake. He slept soundly, unaware of the storm swirling inside me. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the kiss over and over, dissecting every detail, trying to find the moment I could have stopped it, and didn't. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I got up and walked barefoot into the kitchen. The night was still. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. I poured a glass of water and stood at the window, staring into the darkness of the backyard. The guest room light was on. I watched the sliver of illumination beneath his door. And I stood there a long time, not moving, not blinking, as the glass warmed in my hand. Nothing else happened that night. No words. No footsteps. Just silence. But everything had changed. And I had no idea what to do next. Sunday began like most others, with the quiet stretch of morning light crawling slowly across the kitchen floor and the distant sound of birds I no longer bothered to identify. I made coffee the same way I always did, 3 scoops, filtered water, a slow pour, and stood by the sink watching the steam rise like a signal I couldn't interpret. My husband had mentioned the night before that he'd invited some neighbors over for dinner. A small gathering. Nothing formal. He said it in passing, as if it were a detail I'd forget anyway. But I remembered. Because I always remembered things he didn't think mattered. I cleaned the house that morning out of habit, not because it needed it. The baseboards, the shelves, the table legs. My hands moved faster than my mind, wiping, polishing, straightening. I rearranged the candles in the living room and changed the tablecloth in the dining room twice before deciding the first one was fine. He appeared mid-morning with groceries and a distracted look on his face, kissing my cheek absently and asking if we had enough wine. I told him yes. He nodded, already pulling vegetables from the bag, talking about garlic and rosemary and whether the chicken should be grilled or baked. I watched him carefully, as if trying to read between the lines of his movements, wondering what version of me he saw now. The guest offered to help with dinner prep. I wanted to say no. To keep him out of the kitchen, out of the space that had started to feel thinner since that night. But I didn't refuse. I handed him a knife and pointed toward the cutting board. We moved around each other in silence, careful, efficient. The rhythm of cooking filled the air, chopping, sizzling, water boiling. It could have passed for any ordinary afternoon, except it wasn't. The air was thicker. The space between our arms too small. The silence too loud. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same dish. Neither of us flinched, but I felt the shift. The same current, the same undeniable pull. I kept my eyes on the stove and said nothing. The guests arrived around 6. 2 couples from the neighborhood, pleasant and predictable, the type who always brought a bottle of wine and compliments for the host's decor. I smiled, answered questions about the table setting, listened to someone talk about their recent trip to the coast. I nodded in the right places, even laughed once or twice, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Throughout dinner, I watched the way the men talked, my husband gesturing confidently, recounting a story from work, the guest smiling occasionally but saying little. His silence was never empty. It filled the space more than any words could. Our eyes didn't meet that night. Not once. But his presence lingered like a shadow on the tablecloth, in the way he passed the bread to me, in the moment his fingers barely grazed my wrist when reaching for the wine. After dessert, I excused myself to clear the plates. He followed without asking. My husband remained at the table, absorbed in conversation about mortgage rates or home improvements, something rooted in the ordinary, something safe. In the kitchen, I washed the dishes while the guest dried. We worked in silence, the clink of porcelain and the hush of running water the only sounds between us. At one point, He placed a clean plate on the rack and stood for a moment, not moving, not speaking. I didn't look at him. But I knew. His voice, when it came, was quiet. You don't have to carry this alone. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We finished the dishes without another word. That night, after the guests had left and the house settled into its usual hush, I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at the carpet, my bare feet sinking slightly into the fibers. My husband brushed his teeth in the bathroom, humming to himself. I listened to the rhythm of it, the faucet, the shuffle of slippers, the click of the cabinet door. When he emerged, he glanced at me, then turned off the light. Everything went well tonight, he said. I nodded. He got into bed and turned toward the wall. I lay beside him, eyes wide open, staring at the dark. I couldn't sleep. Eventually, I got up and walked barefoot down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the back door. I stepped outside, the night cool against my skin. The garden was still. The trees swayed gently, casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat on the edge of the patio and wrapped my arms around my knees, breathing in the scent of damp earth and night air. I heard the door open behind me. He didn't say anything. Just sat a few feet away, leaving space between us but not too much. We stayed like that for a long time. Two silhouettes in the dark, saying nothing, sharing everything. When I finally stood, I didn't look at him. I walked back into the house without a word. But I felt it. The unraveling had begun. And I was no longer certain I wanted to stop it. The rain came late in the afternoon, slow at first, then steady, the kind that tapped softly against the windows, soaking the world in a hush that made everything feel closer. I was in the kitchen, my hands submerged in soapy water, watching the trees bend gently through the glass. The house was quiet. My husband had gone to the hardware store, leaving behind the scent of his cologne and the clink of his keys on the counter. The guest was in the living room, reading again. He had taken to sitting on the old leather chair near the fireplace, legs crossed, glasses sliding slightly down his nose. He hadn't said much all day, and I hadn't either. But the silence between us wasn't empty. It was layered. I dried my hands and moved to the dining room, checking the table settings for the evening. It was my husband's birthday. Not a milestone year, just another number. But I had decided, out of habit more than celebration, to prepare a dinner. Nothing extravagant. A roast, some wine, a cake I'd baked the night before. The motions kept me grounded. They gave my hands something to do while my mind wandered. I had ironed a dress earlier, one I hadn't worn in years. It hung now from the doorframe of our bedroom, deep burgundy, sleeveless, with a subtle neckline and a fitted waist. I wasn't sure why I chose it. Or maybe I was. It reminded me of a time when I felt more certain of myself, more visible. When the afternoon folded into evening, I lit candles throughout the house, not for romance, but for warmth. The storm outside had brought with it a coldness that seemed to settle into the walls. The flicker of flame offered something gentle, something real. I changed into the dress just before sunset. The zipper was stiff, but it closed. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment, adjusting the hem, smoothing the fabric. My hair was pinned back loosely, a few strands falling over my cheek. I left them there. When I walked into the hallway, he looked up from his book. His gaze lingered for just a second too long, then dropped. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air between us shifted. My husband returned shortly after with a bag of light bulbs and a bottle of scotch. He whistled softly when he saw me. "You look nice," he said. I smiled and thanked him, brushing past him into the kitchen to check the oven. Dinner was quiet. He talked about his day, the project at work, a conversation with an old colleague. I nodded, responded when necessary. The guest added a few remarks, careful, neutral. We moved through the meal like dancers who had forgotten the choreography, stepping over lines that had once been clear. After dessert, my husband excused himself to take a phone call. He stepped outside onto the porch, voice muffled by distance. I began clearing plates, stacking them gently in the sink. The guest stood to help, taking the wine glasses without a word. In the kitchen, our hands met over the faucet. Just once. Neither of us pulled away. The touch was brief. Barely contact at all. But it was enough. I dried my hands, turned, and found him standing close. Too close. We kissed. No hesitation. No words. Just that. It happened quickly, a moment suspended in the stillness of the kitchen, the soft hum of the dishwasher filling the silence afterward like a heartbeat. Then I stepped back. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The look in his eyes was calm, unreadable. He nodded once, like he understood something I couldn't say. My husband came back inside a few minutes later, laughing at something from the call. He didn't notice anything. Or maybe he did. I poured him another glass of scotch and sat beside him on the couch, folding my hands in my lap. He leaned over and kissed my temple. I smiled, resting my head briefly on his shoulder. The familiarity of it almost hurt. Later, when he went upstairs to shower, I stayed in the kitchen, wiping the counter long after it was clean. The guest passed by behind me, pausing at the doorway. "We can't keep doing this," I said softly. "We won't," he replied. But neither of us believed it. That night, I lay awake again, the storm outside having passed, but its echo still alive in the corners of the house. I listened to my husband's breathing, the shift of blankets as he turned in his sleep. In my chest, there was a tightness. Not regret. Not yet. But something close. The kiss hadn't been planned. But it hadn't been resisted either. And I knew, deep in the quiet parts of myself, that something had shifted again. Something I couldn't take back. The days that followed moved with the weight of something unspoken, a kind of heaviness that pressed itself into the rhythm of our home. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtler than that, quiet pauses in conversation, small changes in footsteps, the absence of eye contact at the breakfast table. Nothing overt. But everything felt altered. My husband had to leave for a short work trip, a last-minute thing he mentioned over toast one morning. He apologized, kissed my forehead, said he'd only be gone 2 nights. I nodded and smiled, told him it was fine, that I'd catch up on reading, maybe get some sleep. He seemed relieved, grateful not to be resented. I watched him pack in silence, folding his shirts with a methodical precision that had always calmed me. This time, it made me feel strangely irrelevant. After he left, the house felt different. Not just empty, but exposed. As if something had been peeled back and all that remained was the raw truth of what we'd become, 3 people moving around the same walls, each pretending not to notice the shifts in gravity. The guest stayed quiet most of the day, spending time in the yard fixing something with the garden hose or wiping down the patio furniture. I kept busy too, reorganizing the pantry, dusting behind furniture, rearranging picture frames. We barely crossed paths until late afternoon. It was almost 6 when I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water. I hadn't realized how close it was to dinner. The day had passed in a fog. I apologized absently, saying I hadn't planned a meal. He shrugged, said we could figure it out together. So we did. We made pasta, something simple. I boiled the water while he chopped garlic. We moved easily in the space now, without the stiffness that had defined our interactions before. There was a strange comfort in the simplicity of it, in the small domestic gestures that mimicked normalcy. We ate at the table in silence, the television playing quietly in the background, some documentary I wasn't listening to. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, and the air through the open window smelled like soil and early summer. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he dried. The movements were mechanical, rehearsed. When we finished, I wiped down the counter, then stood with the towel in my hand, not moving. "I think I'm going to read," I said, though I had no book waiting. He nodded. "I'll be on the porch." We separated, each walking in a different direction, but the quiet between us remained tethered by something neither of us named. I went upstairs and sat on the bed, the edges of my dress brushing the backs of my calves. I hadn't changed since the afternoon, and the fabric now felt too formal for the emptiness of the room. I slipped out of it slowly, folded it neatly, and laid it across the armchair in the corner. Downstairs, I could hear the faint creak of the porch floorboards. The sound of presence. Of someone waiting without waiting. I stood by the window, watching the breeze move the curtain. My heart wasn't racing, and that surprised me. Instead, there was a kind of calm settling in. A resignation, maybe. Or acceptance. I walked down the stairs barefoot, the wood cool beneath my feet. The living room was dim, the lamp in the corner casting soft light across the rug. The front door was open, the screen letting in the evening air. He sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring into the dark yard. He didn't hear me approach at first. When he did, he turned his head slightly, not startled. "I didn't mean to stay out here this long," he said. "I don't mind." I sat beside him, leaving space between us. Not much. But enough. The air was still. Not tense. Not charged. Just still. He didn't look at me, and I didn't look at him. We both stared into the quiet. Minutes passed. And then, with no plan, no signal, no ceremony, we spent the night together. There was no conversation afterward. No questions or explanations. Only the softness of shared space and the slow realization that something irreversible had happened. In the morning, I woke before him. The room was filled with pale light, the kind that made everything look gentle and far away. I watched him sleep for a moment, unsure what I was feeling. I stood quietly, gathered my clothes, and dressed without turning on the light. My hands trembled slightly, but I didn't feel panic. It was something else, not peace, but not fear either. Just the echo of a choice I couldn't undo. Downstairs, the house was as it had always been. Coffee waiting to be made. A few dishes in the sink. The newspaper folded neatly on the counter where my husband had left it 2 days before. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. And for the first time in a long while, I realized I no longer knew what came next. Morning light crept through the curtains as if hesitant to enter the room. I sat alone at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee I hadn't touched. The steam had vanished long ago, but I held on to it as though warmth might return if I waited long enough. My palms were damp. The ceramic felt foreign. Upstairs, I could hear the sound of movement. Floorboards shifting beneath slow, deliberate steps. The creak of a drawer. The quiet close of a door. I didn't look up when he entered the room. I didn't have to. The air told me he was there. He didn't speak. He moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, filling a glass with water, rinsing a dish. The silence between us was no longer tense, no longer filled with anticipation. Now, it was something heavier. Final. Like dust settling after a collapse. We hadn't spoken since waking. No words had formed in my mouth that didn't feel inadequate or false. I didn't know what I could say that wouldn't sound like a denial or a plea. And he, for all his quiet certainty, seemed to understand. Or at least accept the absence of explanation. I rose from the table slowly, leaving the mug behind. My legs were stiff, as if I'd aged overnight. I passed by him without a glance and climbed the stairs, feeling every step like a small betrayal of gravity. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, avoiding the mirror. I changed into a soft blue blouse and jeans, clothes that felt neutral, unassuming. I brushed my hair but left it loose. No makeup. No perfume. No pretense. The house felt quieter now. Not in sound, but in presence. Like something had left it. Or someone. By mid-morning, he had gone. Not with a word, not with a bag, not with a goodbye. He simply wasn't there. His shoes were by the door, but his jacket was missing. His phone charger was gone. The guest room looked the same, but it wasn't. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my arms folded across my chest. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe for him to walk back in, to say something, anything. Maybe for me to feel something clearer than this cold, echoing hollowness. But nothing happened. So I began to clean. I started with the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until my knuckles ached. Then the living room, pillows fluffed, books rearranged, floors vacuumed twice. I wiped down the baseboards with a damp cloth, crawling along the floor like I could erase what had happened if I scrubbed hard enough. By afternoon, I was in the laundry room, folding towels with military precision, stacking them by size and shade. The rhythm of it calmed me. The folding, the stacking, the restoring. Everything in its place. As if that meant something. It was well past 4 when I heard my husband's car in the driveway. The crunch of gravel, the engine shutting off, the sound of the door closing with a soft finality. I stood in the hallway, frozen, watching the knob turn. He stepped inside carrying a small suitcase and a paper bag. He smiled, said he picked up pastries from that place I liked near the highway. His voice was easy, casual, warm. The same voice he always used when returning from short trips. I nodded, stepping forward to take the bag from his hand. "Thanks," I said, and my voice didn't tremble. We moved through the house like nothing had changed. He unpacked. I made tea. He asked about the neighbors, about the weather. I answered. Briefly. Carefully. And all the while, I watched for signs. I watched the way his eyes lingered on the hallway, how they passed over the closed guest room door. I watched how he paused before opening the fridge, how he looked at the kitchen table as if trying to remember where things belonged. He didn't ask about the guest. Not once. And that was the first sign. Later, while I folded laundry upstairs, I found his shirt in the hamper, one he hadn't worn in months. It was neatly folded, as though placed there deliberately. But beneath it was something else. A man's t-shirt. Gray. Not my husband's. I held it in my hands for a long time, staring at the fabric, the faint scent still clinging to the collar. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet realization. He knew. Of course he knew. But he hadn't said anything. Not because he didn't care. But because he was waiting. Watching. Giving me space to choose what kind of truth I would offer. That evening, we had dinner on the patio. The sun was setting, and the light turned everything gold. He opened a bottle of wine, poured a glass for each of us. We ate slowly, the sounds of birds and distant wind chimes filling the pauses. At one point, he asked me if I was tired. I said I was. He said I looked it. I nodded. We sat in silence then, sipping our wine, the meal mostly finished, the air turning cooler. There was no confrontation. No accusation. No raised voices or broken plates. Only a quiet understanding settling between us like fog. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was suffocating. Because the truth had finally entered the room. And it no longer needed to be spoken aloud to be real. The following morning began with the usual sounds, water running through the pipes, drawers opening and closing, footsteps in the hallway. I moved through the house like someone walking through a dream they no longer wanted to interpret. The weather had shifted again. Outside, the clouds hung low and heavy, turning everything a dull silver. The light that spilled through the windows felt flat, like it didn't belong to the day. I made breakfast without appetite. Toast, eggs, sliced fruit. I placed the plates on the table, poured coffee, sat down across from my husband. He thanked me, briefly, without looking up from the news on his phone. I watched him more than I listened. Not with suspicion, but with a quiet curiosity. There was something in the way he avoided my gaze, carefully, politely, that told me he was no longer asking questions because he already had the answers. The guest room door remained closed. It had been for days now. I hadn't entered it since the morning he left. The bed was still made, the curtains still drawn, the drawer in the nightstand still open slightly from where he had removed whatever few belongings he brought with him. I hadn't touched anything. It felt too deliberate to disturb, as though the silence inside that room was holding something fragile in place. Around midday, my husband retreated to his study with a folder of paperwork. I used the quiet to organize the hallway closet, lining up coats, folding scarves, shaking out umbrellas that hadn't been touched in months. It was busy work, but it kept my hands moving, which helped. Still, every few minutes I found myself staring off into space, hearing echoes of a voice that was no longer in the house, remembering the way certain words had landed with weight. It wasn't just his absence that haunted me. It was the absence of reaction. My husband didn't confront, accuse, or even ask. That lack of response felt louder than anything he could have said. It made the guilt settle differently, not like a sharp edge but like a blanket laid over everything, soft, suffocating, inescapable. In the afternoon, I went out to the backyard and sat on the edge of the wooden swing beneath the maple tree. The garden was overgrown in places. Weeds had pushed their way through the flower beds, and some of the shrubs were starting to brown around the edges. I ran my fingers along the rope of the swing, feeling the fray of the fibers. I hadn't sat there since early spring. Before everything began to shift. Before I'd allowed myself to blur the lines. Eventually, my husband came outside and joined me, sitting on one of the patio chairs. He brought with him a book and a cup of tea. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed, it was no longer filled with avoidance. It was acknowledgement. He sipped his tea. I watched a pair of birds bicker over space on the fence. Later, after dinner, he asked me if I wanted to go for a drive. I said yes, even though I didn't really feel like leaving the house. He grabbed the keys and waited by the front door while I put on my sweater and slid into shoes that didn't quite fit the season. We didn't speak much in the car. He drove through the familiar streets, past the park, the library, the quiet strip of shops where we used to spend lazy weekends. Everything looked the same, but it felt different now, like someone had painted over the world in thinner, less permanent strokes. Eventually, he turned onto a quiet road outside the neighborhood. One that curved through a wooded area. The trees arched above us, filtering what little sunlight remained into scattered shadows across the windshield. I've been thinking about taking some time off, he said, finally. His voice was steady, careful. I turned slightly toward him, not sure what to say. Just a few days, he continued. Maybe go see my brother. Get out of town. I nodded. That might be good. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. We both understood that the trip wasn't really about his brother. When we got home, he disappeared upstairs, saying something about needing to make a phone call. I stayed downstairs and stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the guest room door. The quiet behind it felt heavier now, like it held something unfinished. Eventually, I walked toward it. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, but I turned it anyway. The room was unchanged. Everything exactly where it had been. The bedding still tucked, the window still closed. I stepped inside and stood for a moment, absorbing the air, which still carried the faintest trace of his cologne. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat there, feeling the weight of choices I couldn't take back. A few minutes later, I opened the nightstand drawer. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Plain, blank on the outside. My fingers hesitated, but I unfolded it. There was no note. No explanation. Just a small black and white photograph. It was old, worn at the corners. The three of us, my husband, our guest, and me, standing in front of a cabin during a long-ago weekend trip. We looked relaxed, young. Before the layers of life had settled over us. Before the distances between us grew. I placed the photo back in the drawer and closed it gently. That night, I slept alone. My husband remained in his study, the door closed, light glowing faintly beneath it until well past midnight. I didn't ask what he was doing. He didn't ask where I had been. We both knew the answers. We simply weren't ready to say them out loud. Not yet. But soon. Soon, the truth would have to come up for air. The morning air carried a strange stillness. Not quiet in the comforting sense, but hollow, like the breath held before a confession. The house felt suspended in that space, the rooms waiting for something unnamed to shift or settle. I woke early and moved through the hallways slowly, as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance that had taken root in our lives. My husband's suitcase sat by the front door. It had been packed the night before, zipped and placed neatly in its usual spot, an unspoken signal that his trip was no longer theoretical. He'd said little about it since mentioning his brother, and I hadn't asked. But I knew he wasn't going there for the reasons he claimed. The destination was irrelevant. What mattered was the space he needed. The silence he required to process something I hadn't dared name between us. He came downstairs just after 7. I was in the kitchen preparing tea, the scent of bergamot and honey blending with the muted light of early day. He greeted me with a quiet good morning and asked if there was any toast. I nodded, placed 2 slices in the toaster, and kept my eyes on the counter. We moved in parallel that morning, never clashing, never colliding, but never intersecting either. He sat at the table with a newspaper he didn't read. I stood at the sink washing a glass that didn't need cleaning. Our voices were placeholders, sparse and careful. When it was time for him to leave, he stood by the door with his hand resting lightly on the handle. I remained a few feet behind, arms folded, unsure of what to say. The air between us was thick, and yet everything we needed to communicate was already hanging there, unspoken but understood. "I'll call you when I get there," he said finally. I nodded. "Drive safe." He paused then, his eyes meeting mine for a single, searching second. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for an apology or offering me forgiveness. Maybe both. Maybe neither. And then he left. The door closed gently behind him. Not a slam. Not a retreat. Just an end to a moment. I stood in the hallway for a while after he was gone. The silence was immediate, swallowing up the house like a tide. I wandered back into the kitchen and stared at the 2 empty mugs on the counter. One still had steam rising from it. I dumped both out and rinsed the sink. The rest of the morning unfolded in pieces. I vacuumed the stairs, dusted the living room shelves, swept the back patio. I folded linens I'd already folded once before. Everything I touched felt too clean, too orderly, like the house was pretending for me, performing stability. Around noon, I went into the guest room. I hadn't touched it since finding the photo. It looked exactly the same tight corners of the bedspread, the same light filtering through the drawn curtain. I stood in the doorway for a long time before walking in. I sat down on the edge of the bed and rested my hands in my lap. The silence in the room was different now, not heavy, not charged, just empty. As if whatever had passed between these walls had now evaporated into something less tangible. I opened the drawer again. The photo was still there, folded neatly, edges soft from time. I held it for a moment, then tucked it back where it had been. It no longer felt like evidence or memory. Just paper. In the afternoon, I went into the garden. The hydrangeas along the back fence had begun to wilt. I knelt by the flower bed and began pulling weeds, my fingernails digging into the soil. The repetitive motion steadied me. With each handful of roots, I felt something leave my body, not guilt, not regret, but the need to keep everything buried. I stayed outside until the sun began to dip. When I finally stood and brushed off my knees, my hands were sore, my shoulders tight. I went inside and washed in the kitchen sink, watching the dirt swirl away as if it could take more than soil with it. That evening, I cooked dinner. Just for myself. A simple soup, some bread. I set the table out of habit, but only used one place setting. The second plate sat untouched at the far end, a quiet echo of evenings now past. I ate slowly. Thoughtfully. Letting the taste sit longer than usual, as if I were trying to remind myself of being present. No distractions. No phone. No conversation. Just the sound of the spoon against the bowl and the wind outside tapping against the windows. After clearing the table, I wandered the house without a destination. The rooms felt larger somehow. Not because they were emptier, but because they had stopped pretending to hold more than they did. There was no weight to carry in them anymore. Only remnants. Eventually, I found myself on the back patio, wrapped in a blanket, holding a mug of tea gone cold again. The stars were faint, the moon just a sliver. The kind of night that hides more than it reveals. I thought about him, our guest. The way he had integrated into the house without ever really belonging to it. The way he listened more than he spoke. The way his presence had offered something I hadn't even known I missed. It wasn't about love. It never was. It was about being seen. But now he was gone. And for the first time, I didn't want him to come back. Not because I hated him. But because I needed to learn who I was without him. Without the weight of desire, or guilt, or secrecy. I needed to face the version of myself that had emerged in the silence, and ask whether she was someone I could live with. Inside, the house exhaled. Floorboards settled. The wind quieted. I stayed out there until the cold made my joints ache. Then I rose, placed the mug gently on the patio table, and walked inside, locking the door behind me. Upstairs, the bed felt unfamiliar in its solitude. But I climbed in anyway, turned off the light, and lay there in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't rehearse what I would say to my husband when he returned. I just lay still. And listened. It was raining when he returned. Not a downpour, but the soft, unbroken kind that makes the world feel quieter than usual. I heard his car pull into the driveway just after noon. I was in the kitchen, peeling carrots for a stew I had started with no real intention to eat. The sound of the engine stopping didn't startle me. I'd been expecting it, somehow had felt its approach before it arrived. I wiped my hands on a towel and moved to the front window. Through the wet glass, I saw him step out of the car, suitcase in one hand, the other pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. He looked the same. Tired, maybe, but otherwise unchanged. There was no visible tension in his body, no anger in the way he moved. Just calm, like someone returning to something he wasn't sure still existed. He didn't knock, didn't hesitate. The door opened with the same familiar creak, and then he was inside. He stood in the entryway for a moment, dripping quietly onto the mat. I remained in the kitchen, not moving to greet him, not hiding either. We looked at each other across the house, a hallway between us and 1,000 unspoken things. His eyes held mine, steady and unreadable. And then he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and carried his suitcase upstairs. I returned to the carrots. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments. I vacuumed the living room. He unloaded the dishwasher. I took the laundry upstairs. He sat in the study, flipping through papers without really reading them. We moved through the same space like familiar ghosts, aware of each other, but unwilling to disturb the equilibrium that had formed in our absence. Dinner was simple. I finished the stew. He sliced bread. We ate at the table without music, without conversation. Not out of resentment, but because silence now seemed like the only language we both understood. At one point, he looked at me and asked if the neighbors had stopped by. I said no. He nodded and returned to his bowl. After we ate, I gathered the dishes and carried them to the sink. He followed me, placed his plate beside mine, and stood there for a moment as I turned on the water. I thought a lot while I was gone, he said, not looking at me. I nodded but didn't respond. I thought about how things get to this point. How people stop seeing each other, even when they're looking. The water ran over my hands. I scrubbed the inside of a bowl slowly, carefully. I'm not angry, he added. That made me stop. I turned off the faucet and stood there, the wet dishcloth still in my hand. I didn't turn around when I spoke. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know. A pause settled between us like dust. Heavy, quiet. I just want honesty, he said finally. Not explanations. Just the truth. Even if it's ugly. I turned then, meeting his gaze. For the first time in weeks, I saw something open in his expression. Not blame. Not hurt. Just something waiting to be met with equal weight. I didn't lie. I told him about the first night. About the shift I had felt, the pull I hadn't expected. I told him about the moments that followed, how small gestures became signals, how something inside me had cracked without warning. I didn't dramatize, didn't defend. I just laid it out, bare and still. He listened without interrupting. Without turning away. When I finished, he closed his eyes for a long moment, then nodded. I already knew, he said. I just needed to hear you say it. We didn't embrace. There were no tears. No cinematic climax. Just two people in a kitchen, breathing the same air, acknowledging that the floor beneath them had shifted and neither was falling. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room while he showered. The fire was low, the room dim. I held a small notepad in my lap, the kind I used for grocery lists or client notes. On it, I wrote one sentence. I forgot how to be seen without being wanted. I stared at the words for a long time before tearing the page out and folding it once, then again. I didn't throw it away. I didn't hide it. I placed it on the mantel, just above the fireplace, and left it there. When he came downstairs, we didn't talk about what would happen next. Whether we would stay or separate. Whether we would rebuild or release. There was no resolution. Only a mutual understanding that clarity didn't always come with answers. Sometimes it came with silence, and time, and space. We sat together on the couch. Not touching. Not speaking. Just there. Eventually, he asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. He went to the kitchen. I stayed in the quiet. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like the beginning of something slower, more honest. Maybe not healing. Not yet. But truth. And that was something.